remember the exact moment my husband laughed and said, "Claire doesn't really do anything. She just follows orders." And the entire table joined in like it was the most natural joke in the world. Like I wasn't even sitting there holding a fork that suddenly felt too heavy to lift. My father-in-law leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass, and added, "Some people just aren't built to lead," and no one corrected him, not even the man who once promised to stand beside me. They didn't yell. They didn't argue. They just erased me quietly, politely. In a room filled with warm light and polished silver, as if I had always been optional. And the worst part wasn't the words, it was how comfortable they were saying them. How certain they were that I would sit there and take it, like I always had. If this story speaks to your heart, only if this story truly resonates with you. Take a second to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from, along with your local time, because I want to know who is out there listening to this at this exact moment. My name is Claire Whitmore. I'm 32 years old, and that dinner was the night my husband's family decided I was useless, and the last night they were ever going to believe that. It had been 5 years since I married into the Whitmore family. 5 years of quiet dinners, careful smiles, and conversations that always seemed to circle around success, status, and worth, as if those things could be measured by job titles and office sizes. My father-in-law built his entire identity around his position at a defense contracting firm, a man who believed power came from boardrooms and signatures, not from the kind of work that didn't make headlines. My husband, Daniel, followed right behind him, polished, ambitious, always eager to prove he belonged in that same world. And somewhere along the way, I became the contrast, the quiet one, the one whose career didn't fit neatly into their understanding of success. That night, the table was set like always, 6 plates, 6 glasses, the same roast beef my mother-in-law made every Sunday, the same soft jazz playing in the background, everything so familiar it almost felt rehearsed, and maybe it was. Daniel had already started talking about a major project his company was pitching, something about government contracts and strategic partnerships, words that floated over the table like currency. And every time he spoke, my father-in-law nodded with this quiet pride, like he was watching his legacy unfold in real time. Then, as if on cue, my mother-in-law turned to me with that same polite smile that never quite reached her eyes and asked, "And you, Claire? Still moving around a lot?" It was always phrased like that, soft, almost kind, but underneath it was the same question they had been asking for years. What do you actually do, and why does it not seem to matter? I took a sip of water before answering, letting the silence stretch just a second longer than they expected. "Something like that," I said. And Daniel chuckled under his breath, shaking his head like I had just confirmed something obvious. "She's being modest," he added, his tone light, casual. "Claire's job is flexible. No real structure, no long-term strategy. Just following orders, right?" The way he said it made it sound like a flaw, like obedience was the opposite of intelligence, and the table responded exactly how he wanted. A few quiet laughs, a couple of knowing looks, my father-in-law setting his glass down with a soft clink as he leaned forward. "That's the difference," he said, not even looking directly at me. "Some people build things, others just take direction." I didn't argue. I didn't correct them. I didn't remind them of anything they hadn't bothered to ask about in years. I just sat there, listening, watching the way their confidence grew with every unchallenged assumption, and I let them have that moment, because in less than 12 hours, the same people who were laughing across that table would be sitting in a room where titles actually meant something, where authority wasn't guessed or assumed, but recognized instantly, and I knew exactly how that moment would unfold, because I had already lived it in my head more times than I could count. They thought that dinner defined me. They thought those words would stay true the next morning. They had no idea that by the time the sun came up, everything they believed about me would collapse without a single argument from my side, and the silence that followed would say more than I ever could. And the truth is, that night didn't start the way they thought it did. It started years earlier, long before I ever sat at that table. Back when I first realized that being underestimated wasn't a weakness, It was an advantage. I learned early in that family that silence could be mistaken for weakness if you did not understand what stood behind it, and for years, that misunderstanding worked in my favor more than they could ever imagine. The first time I sat at that table as Daniel's fiancé, I remember how his father asked me what I planned to do long-term, the way someone might ask a teenager about summer plans, and when I told him I had accepted a commission, he gave a slow nod. The kind that looked supportive from a distance but carried no real respect, and said, "Well, that is admirable, I suppose, if you are not aiming for something more permanent." And everyone moved on as if that settled it, as if my future had just been quietly categorized and filed away. Over time, the comments became more refined, less direct but sharper in their implication, like polished glass that still cut if you handled it wrong. My mother-in-law would ask if I ever thought about transitioning into something more stable. Daniel would joke about how I was never in one place long enough to build anything real, and his brother once asked me, completely serious, if I ever got tired of just taking orders all day, and I would answer them the same way every time, calmly, briefly, giving them nothing to push against, because I realized something they did not. The less I explained, the more certain they became that they had already figured me out. There is a kind of confidence people have when they believe they are the smartest person in the room, and Daniel's family carried that confidence like a shared language, reinforced at every dinner, every holiday, every conversation that revolved around promotions, acquisitions, bonuses, and the subtle hierarchy they had built around themselves. In their world, leadership meant visibility, recognition, a name on a door or a title that could be introduced at a party, and any zest of that framework simply did not register as real power. I remember one Christmas when Daniel's father gave a long speech about legacy, about building something that lasts, about the importance of control and direction, and as he spoke, he glanced at Daniel with pride, then briefly at me with something closer to tolerance, and said, "It takes a certain kind of mind to lead. Not everyone is wired for it." And I sat there, hands folded in my lap, listening to a man define leadership without ever realizing he was speaking to someone who had already been responsible for decisions that affected lives far beyond anything discussed at that table. But I did not correct him, not then, not ever, because correcting them would have required their willingness to understand, and they had none. Instead, I watched, I listened, and I learned exactly how they saw me, not as a threat, not even as an equal, but as a fixed point in their story. The quiet wife, the one without clear direction, the one who existed just outside the center of importance. And Daniel, more than anyone, believed it, because it was easier for him to believe that his world was the only one that mattered than to consider that mine might operate on a level he could not see. I remember the night he told a group of his colleagues that I kept things simple compared to what he dealt with, and the way they all nodded, relieved. As if that confirmed something comforting about the balance of power in a relationship, and I stood there beside him, composed, unaffected on the surface, while inside I made a quiet decision that I would never again try to translate my world into terms they could understand. That was the moment something shifted for me, not in anger, not in resentment, but in clarity, because I understood that being underestimated gave me a kind of freedom they would never experience, the freedom to move without scrutiny, to operate without interference, to hold authority without having to defend it in conversations that were never designed to recognize it in the first place. And from that point on, every dinner, every comment, every dismissive glance became something else entirely, not a wound to react to, but a pattern to observe, a script I knew by heart, one that would eventually play out exactly the way I expected, because people who are certain they understand you rarely look twice. And that certainty was the very thing that would make what happened the next morning impossible for them to ignore. I stopped trying to measure myself against their definition of worth the day I realized they had never once asked a real question about what I did, not because they forgot, but because they assumed the answer would not matter. And that assumption became the foundation of every conversation that followed. After that Christmas dinner, I remember standing alone in the kitchen while everyone else moved into the living room, their voices carrying easily through the house, laughter rising and falling like background noise, And I caught my reflection in the dark window above the sink, still, composed, almost detached, and I asked myself a question I had avoided for years, not whether they respected me, but whether I needed them to. The answer came quietly, but it stayed. No. Because respect that has to be explained is never really given, and I had spent too long trying to translate a life they were never interested in understanding. My world did not look like theirs. It was not built around meetings that ended at 5 o'clock or metrics that could be presented in quarterly reports. It operated on precision, responsibility, and decisions that did not come with applause. And over time, I had learned to carry that without needing anyone at that table to validate it. But that did not mean their words did not leave a mark. It just meant I chose where to place that mark, not as something that weakened me, but as something that sharpened my focus. I remember one evening not long before that dinner, Daniel and I were driving back from a company event, the city lights stretching across the highway in long, steady lines, and he was talking about a promotion he was expecting, outlining the strategy, the people involved, the influence he would gain, and then, almost as an afterthought, he glanced at me and said, "You would not really understand. It is a different level of responsibility." And there was no malice in his voice, just certainty. The same certainty I had seen at that table so many times before, and I turned to look out the window, not because I was hurt, but because I realized in that moment that he truly believed it. That was the difference. They were not trying to diminish me. They had already decided where I belonged. And once someone decides who you are, they stop looking for anything that contradicts it. That realization did not come all at once. It built slowly, in small moments, in passing comments, in the way conversations shifted when I spoke, or did not shift at all, and eventually, it changed how I moved through that space entirely. I stopped offering details. I stopped correcting assumptions. I stopped trying to fit my experiences into language they would accept. Instead, I let them build their version of me, because I understood something they did not. Their version was incomplete, and one day, that gap would matter. That is the part people misunderstand about silence. They think it means there is nothing to say, when, in reality, it often means there is too much, and it is simply not the right moment. And that night at the dinner table, as Daniel's words settled into the room and the laughter followed, I felt that same clarity return, sharper this time, more immediate, because I knew exactly how close we were to that moment. I could map it out in hours. Less than 12. By morning, the same names, the same voices, the same people who had just dismissed me so easily would be sitting in a room where titles were not guessed, where authority was not debated over dinner, where recognition was immediate and undeniable. And the person who would make that recognition would not be me. That was the part I had planned carefully, the part I had waited for, because in their world, validation only counted if it came from someone they already respected. I did not need to prove anything to them. I just needed the right person to walk into the room and say my name the way it was meant to be said. And when that happened, I knew there would be no argument, no explanation, no defense. Just a shift, quiet but absolute, the kind that leaves people searching for words they can no longer find. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself a small, almost invisible smile, not because I was looking forward to their reaction, but because I was finally done waiting for it. I woke before the alarm, the room still dark, the kind of quiet that settles just before sunrise, and for a few seconds I lay there without moving, letting the stillness anchor me, because I knew that once my feet touched the floor, everything would begin to shift. There was no hesitation, no second guessing, just a steady awareness of what the day required and who I needed to be when it unfolded. I moved through the apartment with deliberate precision, each step measured, each action familiar, almost ritualistic in its consistency, and when I opened the garment bag hanging near the closet, the fabric inside caught the early light just enough to reveal the structure beneath it, clean lines, sharp edges, the kind of presence that did not need to announce itself to be recognized. I took my time, not because I was nervous, but because details mattered, the alignment of insignia, the smoothness of the fabric, the exact placement of every element that would later speak for me without a single word. This was not about appearance, it was about accuracy. about stepping into a role that had been earned long before anyone at that dinner table decided who I was. In the mirror, I did not look for confidence. I did not need to find it. It was already there, steady and unshaken, shaped by years of responsibility that had never required an audience. I adjusted the collar once, then stepped back, not to admire, but to confirm. Everything in place, nothing excessive, nothing missing. Across the city, I knew Daniel and his father were starting their morning in a very different way. Coffee poured quickly, conversations already circling around projections, expectations, the assumption that this meeting would unfold like any other, another step forward in a career they understood, a system they believed they controlled. They would walk into that building with the same confidence they carried into every room, the kind that comes from never having your authority questioned, never having your role challenged. I picked up my briefcase, the weight of it familiar, not heavy, but substantial enough to remind me of what it carried. Documents that represented months of evaluation, decisions that would shape outcomes far beyond a single boardroom. And I paused only once before leaving, a brief moment by the door, not out of doubt, but out of recognition, because I understood that this was the point where everything separated. The version of me they believed in and the reality they had never seen would finally occupy the same space. The drive was quiet, the roads still light with early traffic. The city stretching awake in slow increments, and I did not turn on the radio, did not reach for my phone. I let the silence remain, because it matched the clarity I felt, a kind of focus that did not need distraction. When I arrived, the building stood exactly as it always had, tall, controlled glass reflecting the pale morning sky, a place that represented authority in their world, contracts, negotiations, decisions made behind closed doors. And as I stepped out, the air carried that crisp edge of early day, cool enough to sharpen your senses. Inside, everything moved with quiet efficiency. People in tailored suits, conversations kept low, purposeful, and I walked through it without hesitation, without pause, not because I needed to assert anything, but because I belonged there in a way they had never imagined. The conference room was already prepared, long table, screens lit, chairs arranged with precision, and I placed my briefcase down, taking a seat not at the edge, not an observation, but at the position that had been assigned to me. The one that did not require explanation, and for a moment, the room was still, waiting, the kind of stillness that exists just before something shifts. Footsteps approached in the hallway, voices familiar, confident, Daniel's tone easy, his father's measured, and I could hear the subtle rhythm of their expectations, unchanged from the night before, as if nothing had already begun to move beneath them. And when the door opened, I did not look up immediately. I let them enter the room they believed they understood. Let them take in the space without realizing what had already changed, because the most powerful moments are not the ones where you announce yourself. They are the ones where the truth reveals itself without warning. And in that quiet space, just seconds before anyone spoke, I knew exactly how the next moment would unfold. Daniel stepped into the room first, mid-sentence, still talking about projected margins and timelines, his voice carrying that same easy confidence from the night before, as if the world had not shifted even slightly since he last laughed across the dinner table. His father followed just behind him, scanning the room with practiced familiarity, the kind of glance that measured status without appearing to, and for a brief moment, neither of them noticed me, not because I was hidden, but because I was not where they expected me to be. That was always the gap, expectation. Daniel reached for a chair near the middle of the table, setting his folder down with a quiet tap, already preparing to take his usual role in a space he believed he understood. And his father gave a short nod to a colleague across the room before finally letting his gaze pass over me, not stopping, not registering, just moving past as if I were part of the background, someone present but irrelevant. I did not move. I did not speak. I let the moment stretch just long enough for their assumptions to settle into place, because that is how certainty works. It builds quietly until it feels undeniable. "We should get started as soon as the director arrives," Daniel said, glancing at the clock, his tone efficient, controlled. The same tone he used at home when he explained things he thought I could not fully grasp. And I could almost hear the echo of his voice from the night before, casual, dismissive, certain. His father pulled out his chair, adjusting his jacket as he sat, leaning slightly toward Daniel as they exchanged a few low comments about the structure of the meeting. Both of them relaxed, both of them unaware that the structure they were discussing no longer applied in the way they believed it did. One of the junior analysts entered quietly, placing a set of documents near the head of the table, and, for a second, his eyes flicked toward me, a brief pause, a subtle recognition that did not reach the others, and then he stepped back, returning to his position near the wall. That was the first shift, small, almost invisible, but real. Daniel noticed it, just barely, a slight narrowing of his eyes as he followed the movement, then dismissed it just as quickly because it did not fit the narrative he had already decided was true. "Excuse me," he said, turning slightly toward me now, his voice polite but edged with confusion. "This section is reserved for senior leadership." And there it was, not an insult, not even intentional, just the natural extension of everything he believed about me, and I met his gaze calmly, not correcting him, not reacting, just holding the silence between us for a fraction longer than he expected. His father shifted in his seat, glancing at me more directly now, a hint of impatience crossing his expression, the same look he used when something disrupted the order he relied on, and I could see the question forming before he spoke it, the quiet assumption that I had made a mistake by being there. "Claire," he said, his tone measured, controlled, "I think you might be in the wrong room." And a few of the others around the table looked up, curiosity replacing routine, their attention beginning to shift in a way Daniel and his father had not yet registered. I folded my hands lightly on the table, the surface cool beneath my fingertips, and for the first time since they entered, I let my gaze move fully across the room, not searching, not uncertain, just aware, and then I looked back at them, steady, composed, saying nothing. The silence held, not awkward, not tense, just present, and in that silence, something subtle began to change, not in what was visible, but in what was expected, because uncertainty, once introduced, has a way of spreading quietly through a room that was built on certainty. Daniel opened his mouth as if to say something else, something to correct the situation, to restore the version of reality he understood. But before he could, footsteps approached from the hallway, measured, deliberate, carrying a different kind of authority, one that did not need to be announced, and as the door began to open, I saw the exact moment the room shifted again, not because of anything I had done, but because the right person had just stepped into the space, and everything that followed would no longer belong to them. The sound of that salute did not echo. It settled, quiet and absolute, like something final clicking into place, and for a moment no one in the room moved, not Daniel, not his father, not even the people who had been watching the exchange unfold with growing uncertainty. The director's voice had been steady, respectful, precise, the kind of tone reserved for someone whose authority was not questioned, and when he said, "Good morning, ma'am," it was not a gesture, it was recognition, clear and undeniable. I acknowledged it with a small nod, nothing more, and opened the folder in front of me as if the room had not just shifted around us, as if this had always been exactly where I belonged. No one laughed. No one spoke. The same people who had filled the dinner table with easy certainty the night before now sat frozen in a silence they did not know how to navigate, and I could feel it, not as tension, but as awareness, the kind that arrives when something you believed without question suddenly no longer holds. Daniel did not look at me at first, his gaze fixed somewhere just past the edge of the table, like he was trying to recalculate everything he thought he understood, and his father, the man who had spent years defining leadership in terms he controlled, sat back slowly, his expression no longer measured, but uncertain, searching for footing that was no longer there. I did not need to say anything to them. There was nothing to prove, nothing to defend, because the truth had already been introduced in the only language they had ever respected, authority recognized by someone they trusted. The meeting continued, structured, efficient, exactly as it was meant to, but everything underneath it had changed, and when it ended, no one rushed to fill the silence that followed. Because some moments do not invite conversation. They simply leave you with what is. Life after that day did not become perfect, it became clear. I no longer sat at tables where my presence had to be explained, and I no longer shaped myself to fit into spaces that had already decided who I was before I spoke. Distance came naturally, not out of anger, but out of understanding. Because sometimes the healthiest boundary is the one you stop trying to justify. What I learned is simple, but it took years to accept. You do not need to convince people of your worth when they have already chosen not to see it. And you do not need to stay where you are only valued when someone else speaks on your behalf. If you're listening to this and you have ever felt invisible in a room where you should have been seen, I want you to know that your silence does not make you small, and your patience does not make you weak. It means you are waiting for the right moment, the right space, or perhaps the right people who will not need it explained at all. Thank you for being here, for listening, for allowing this story to meet you wherever you are, because sometimes hearing that you are not alone is enough to make the weight a little lighter. And if you feel comfortable sharing, I would like to ask you this. Have you ever been underestimated by people who should have known you best, and what did that teach you about yourself? And if this story truly resonated with you, you can show your support in a quiet way, only if it feels right to you. My name is Claire Whitmore. I am 32 years old, and the lesson I want to leave you with is this. Never let someone else's limited view define the full scope of who you are.